In 1983, the American video game market hit a huge recession. Nobody wanted to buy video games anymore, so distributors were forced to sell them for pennies. Financial experts of the time considered video games to be a dead market. This 1983 video game crash was the result of the public losing faith after being burned one too many times by cheap, overhyped cash grabs that lacked any sense of quality assurance. So, what's changed, right? But video games were still doing okay over in Japan, and 1985 would see the release of Nintendo's Famicom in America, rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System. Due to the stigma surrounding video games in the States, Nintendo of America did everything they could to avoid marketing the NES as a video game system. It was right there in the name. This wasn't a game console, it was an entertainment system. They marketed it as more of a toy or appliance, and stocked it in toy aisles rather than electronics sections. And for whatever reason, this tactic really worked. The NES sold outrageous numbers. Throughout the late 80s, the name Nintendo would become synonymous with video games as a whole. People didn't go home and play video games, they went home to play their Nintendo. And the company's flagship 1985 title, Super Mario Bros., is often cited as single-handedly saving the American video games industry. What can be said about Super Mario Bros. At this point? This game practically invented the side-scrolling platformer, and this one broke new ground by being one of, if not the first video game, to actually be able to, side-scroll. Other platformers of the era could only string multiple static screens together to simulate scrolling, but Mario had the camera seamlessly following the player, centering the action on their character at all times. The only hang-up is that, whether it was intentional design or technical limitation, the screen could only scroll to the right. Once the left edge of the screen was gone, it was gone. Now, it's time for me to come clean about something. I am awful at traditional 2D Mario games, like absolute dog shit. And this likely stems from the fact that I never really played 2D Mario as a kid. I would occasionally play some Mario World on a friend's SNES during sleepovers, and I remember getting fairly far in Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy during long family car rides. But for the most part, I was more of a Sonic kid, and maybe it's for that reason that I've never been able to get the hang of Mario games. Everything about these things just fucks with years of conditioning and muscle memory I've developed from Sonic games. And so while I've gone basically my whole life hearing gaming enthusiasts gush over how immaculate, smooth, and precise Super Mario Bros. Controls are, I've just never felt that way. This is probably going to make me some enemies, and yeah, it is pretty rich coming from the guy who just admitted that he's awful at these games. Skill issue, but Super Mario Bros. Seems so stiff most of the time, downright unresponsive even. It never really feels like the character is doing what I need him to do. For one thing, Mario can only barely change direction in midair, so any even slightly ill-timed jump can prove fatal. His running speed never feels right to me, assuming he even responds to me holding the button at all. And while I'm at it, I've quite frankly never understood why the 2D Marios feel the need for a run button at all, because I can't think of any situation where I wouldn't want to be running. Just make it his default speed. Your walking speed is completely impractical, and jumping without running is useless too, since the game does use something resembling momentum physics. A standing jump gets you basically nowhere. I get it, it's a precision platformer, you're meant to practice and get good with these controls, but even the simplest of precision jumps can end badly if you land just a smidge off of the right pixel. It just feels like an unfair and unforgiving game a lot of the time, with a good half of the deaths feeling like they weren't even my fault. And after playing Flicky the other day, I can honestly say that those running and jumping controls feel better by comparison. I almost wish every retro platformer controlled like Flicky. Super Mario Bros. Can also be incredibly unforgiving with enemy hitboxes and behavior. Sometimes I would land on top of an enemy, expecting them to die, only to be a single pixel off and end up losing a life instead. Anytime Lakitu showed up, I was actively cursing at the screen. And if you ever want to see me hit a brick wall in a Mario game, just plop a Hammer Bro in front of me. These things are my kryptonite. It's like every skill and reflex I've learned through my decades of playing video games disappears into the ether the second I'm forced to get past one of these guys. Let's just say I'm glad the Wii U Virtual Console has suspend points, or I would never have beaten this game. To give credit where it's due though, the level design in Super Mario Bros. Is brilliant. Essay after essay has been written about the way this game teaches you how to play simply through the layout of each level. And in those rare moments where I got into the zone and everything clicked and I managed to dash through a stage and land every single jump exactly right, that felt amazing. And I can imagine the swimming physics in this game blowing people's minds back in 1985. I love every single water segment in this game. Super Mario Bros., despite my personal problems with it, is definitely the type of game that seems incredibly satisfying to finally master, and the huge speedrunning community for the game certainly attests to that. And perhaps most noteworthy of all, Super Mario Bros. Showed us that games can have unique lore. No longer were game concepts limited to tropey sci-fi spaceships or homages to existing movies and stories, nor were they completely abstract like Pac-Man, so far removed from anything resembling reality that it all just becomes meaningless nonsense. Super Mario Bros. Found the sweet spot in between those two extremes. Mario wasn't just a working-class stiff from Brooklyn. He now has an established world and lore filled with both the familiar and the fantastical. Enemies look like mushrooms and turtles, and Mario is still just a guy, but the Mushroom Kingdom operated on its own weird rules, like floating blocks with coins in them, and warp pipes and mushrooms that make you grow, and flowers that let you shoot fire from your palms. Of all the things that Super Mario Bros. Contributed to the gaming landscape, I think the most important is that it taught us that it's okay for games to be just a little bit weird. In February 1986, Nintendo would release The Legend of Zelda, a top-down action-adventure game set in the fantasy land of Hyrule. Fun fact, the title screen music was originally going to be Maurice Ravel's Bolero, but Nintendo realized it wasn't in the public domain yet, and so they had to change it. But you know what else used Bolero as a theme? Digimon, and believe you me, any opportunity to bring up Digimon, I will fucking do it. The Digivolution is up and running. Did you see? Did you hear? Did you know what's coming? Players take control not of Zelda, but a young boy named Link, tasked with rescuing Princess Zelda and recovering the stolen Triforce of Power from the clutches of the evil wizard Ganon. To do so, he must travel Hyrule's epic landscape, discovering hidden areas and dungeons, and defeating Ganon's beasts to collect broken shards of the Triforce of Wisdom, the key to vanquishing Ganon. Shigeru Miyamoto, Mario creator and basically the face of Nintendo, found the inspiration to create Zelda from memories of exploring the hills around his childhood home in Kyoto, Japan. He would discover caves and decide to explore them, armed with nothing but a gas-powered lamp and hand-drawn maps. This sense of discovery was what he hoped to capture in Zelda's sprawling overworld map, in a game that has gone on to become a pioneer in open-world game design. The player is dropped into the middle of a huge map with no direction or guide, with only their instincts and curiosity to rely on, and the map included with the instruction manual if they were lucky, since the in-game map is next to useless. Seriously, what is this? It's just gray nothing. That doesn't tell me anything. Why is this here? To those of you too young to remember, the idea of an open-world game simply didn't exist in the 1980s. The term open world hadn't even been coined yet. And even after Zelda, that type of game wouldn't become mainstream until sometime in the 2000s. Zelda was groundbreaking for its time. Link can explore the overworld to his heart's content, and dungeons can be completed out of order. In fact, once you've bought some bombs right at the beginning of the game, you can theoretically head straight to Spectacle Rock and blow open the entrance to Ganon's lair on Death Mountain. Granted, you won't get far inside without possessing the Triforce shards. The enemies outside can kill you in one hit, and even if you could progress through the dungeon, you wouldn't actually be able to defeat Ganon without the silver arrows. But the simple fact that you can head straight to the final area as soon as you want was, at the time, an unheard-of type of game design. Imagine if the first warp zone in Super Mario Bros. Took you straight to level 8-4 instead of just skipping you ahead a few levels. The idea of games being non-linear was something that hadn't been done before, ever, and it felt incredibly freeing to players in the 80s. The game itself is controlled from a top-down perspective, but movement is not tile-based. Link can move freely across the map, but unfortunately only in 4 directions. He's also apparently not a very accomplished swordsman, only able to stab directly in front of him, but his sword is capable of firing a beam whenever Link's health bar is full. He can collect in-game currency, known as rupees, to buy various supplies and upgrades, and the rupee counter also doubles as his arrow supply once he finds a bow. Because I guess Nintendo didn't feel like programming another value in? Link begins the game with only 3 hearts on his health bar, but additional hearts can be collected by defeating each boss, as well as a few hidden throughout the overworld. His first sword is a wooden one that deals piddly damage, but 2 stronger ones can be obtained once his health bar passes certain thresholds, and he can also buy or collect magic rings that grant him additional defense. Each of the game's 9 dungeons hides a compass and map to help you navigate their depths, as well as at least one new piece of equipment and a boss, and sometimes mini-bosses as well. Some new equipment are simply weapons to add to Link's arsenal, such as a boomerang, but others are tools that aid him in traversing the overworld and discovering new areas, such as the raft. The American NES version of Zelda did see a few minor tweaks from the Japanese release. In Japan, the game was made for the Famicom Disk System, which, while being more or less identical in hardware, had a few features that the American NES did not. The Famicom, for instance, had a built-in microphone, which the player could yell into to defeat the Pole's voice enemies. Since the NES lacked a microphone, the US game was tweaked to make Pole's voices weak to arrows instead. The Famicom Disk System also used floppy disks as opposed to the NES's cartridges, meaning the Japanese game was capable of saving the player's progress. Believe it or not, Zelda was the first video game to have this sort of save feature, and it was almost required due to the game's, at the time, massive scale and length. The American version, as a result, was the first game cartridge to include a lithium battery to preserve saved game files. Once Link defeats Ganon and rescues Princess Zelda, the player can start over in a harder second quest, with redesigned dungeon layouts and item locations rearranged, designed to be much more difficult than the first time. This second quest can also be accessed by simply inputting your name as Zelda when starting a new file. And man, I feel sorry for any poor little girl named Zelda who started up the game, put in her name, and was then thoroughly disheartened by the game mercilessly kicking their ass for no discernible reason. Between the sheer size and scale of the game, in addition to its second quest, Nintendo marketed The Legend of Zelda as being an endless adventure, and the game would go on to be one of Nintendo's biggest successes of the NES era, despite the American commercials for the game being apparently hell-bent on making it look as lame as possible.
It's The Legend of Zelda and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad. Octoroks, Tektites, Levers too. But with your help, our hero pulls through.
I guess the allure of the so-called never-ending adventure outweighed the terrible ads for most people. And yeah, to a first-time player without a walkthrough, this game can seem like it never ends. And that was the main aspect of its appeal. Secrets seemed almost infinite, dungeons seemed to just keep on coming. But the beauty comes in mastering the game and learning how it all works. For instance, each screen in the game is only capable of hiding one secret, so while not every screen will be hiding something, you'll know you can stop looking once you find something. Outside of the relentless final dungeon, a fully decked out Link can survive almost anything the game throws at him, and the accomplishment comes in discovering it all on your own to make your character as strong as he can be. Overall, Zelda is absolutely a classic game, and unlike some other first entries of long-lasting franchises, it still holds up extremely well. It's difficult, but not infuriatingly so. Every mistake the player makes feels honest. It never feels like the game isn't playing fair. Its sense of exploration and discovery feels more organic than a lot of its sequels, and it's really the type of game where I would recommend not using a walkthrough if you can help it, just a few maps and your own intuition. Because Zelda is gaming's earliest and purest distillation of the wonders of discovery. Once Zelda proved to be a success, Nintendo began reflecting on their current catalog of games and thinking of new genres to explore. At some point, they realized their library lacked a strong sci-fi entry, and so development on one was put into motion in early 1986. The game would combine the side-scrolling running and jumping of Mario with the non-linear exploration and item gathering of Zelda, all wrapped in a space-themed shooter and largely inspired by Ridley Scott's 1979 film Alien. One of the game's bosses would even be named Ridley in honor of this. The game would be titled Metroid, a portmanteau of Metro and Android, and would be released the following August. Metroid puts players in the role of bounty hunter Samus Aran, exploring the uninhabited planet Zebes, or is it Zebeth, in the search for the evil space pirate facility said to be hiding there. Oh, and Samus is a woman, by the way. That's pretty common knowledge by now. The reveal is one of the most iconic twists in all of gaming, so I'm not going to try to be cute about it. Samus is a lady. Much like Zelda, the player is dropped into a large world with no map or clear objective, but this time the action is presented from a side-scrolling perspective. Players who follow their Mario instincts and head to the right upon starting the game will quickly find their progress blocked by a low ceiling they have no way to traverse, but heading to the left from where they start will reveal the first of the game's many upgrades, this one allowing Samus to roll into a ball and get through tight areas. This clues players in to how the rest of the game is going to work. Explore everywhere. From there, the player is given several different directions they can go, all with their own equipment and secrets to discover. This type of non-linear level design had never been attempted in a side-scroller before, and Metroid used its combination of two different genres to very interesting effect. Hidden all throughout Planet Zebes's depths are upgrades for Samus, and these can be either new weapons such as bombs and missiles, or movement enhancements like the high jump boots. Some upgrades function as both, such as the screw attack. Unlike Zelda, there are no keys to find, and this is what makes Metroid game design stand out compared to other exploration-based games. Instead of having your inventory split between weapons and keys, Samus's weapons are her keys. This means that every new piece of equipment you find also allows you to access new areas elsewhere, which makes every discovery feel exciting and makes every piece of equipment multi-purpose. The Mari doesn't just allow you to squeeze through gaps, it's also your means of planting bombs. In turn, bombs themselves can be used as weapons or as tools for revealing new areas. Missiles are your strongest source of firepower and also the method to unlock sealed doors. The ice beam allows you to freeze enemies in place, which renders them immobile and harmless, but also, in defiance of all laws of physics, turns enemies into floating platforms you can use to gain additional height. The screw attack is one of Samus's most useful pieces of gear, turning her body into an indestructible weapon every time she performs one of her forward-spinning jumps. Every item you find has more than one function, which is something even modern-day games have trouble with pulling off. While the world map isn't to quite the same scale as Zelda's massive overworld, there's still a lot to see and discover in Metroid. But unlike a Mario or Zelda game, Metroid doesn't do such a good job at making it clear to the player where certain secrets may be, which can prove pretty detrimental as some of these so-called secrets are actually required for progress. One single unremarkable floor tile in Norfair has to be bombed open in order for the player to finish the game, but there is nothing cluing the player into this. They're just sort of expected to be shooting and bombing everything in sight for no reason, and the game does this more than once, with possibly the meanest example being a few instances of fake acid floors that are indistinguishable from actual hazards. The player has no reason to actively jump into one of these things. I suppose once the player realizes that not every destructible piece of the environment will be telegraphed to them, they'll be more suspicious of dead ends and more likely to experiment with their arsenal to discover things, but the game never communicates to the player that this even needs to be done in the first place. It's not uncommon to hear stories of new players getting completely roadblocked after a certain point because they've seemingly explored everything and can't figure out what they need to do. Samus also has two different types of beams she can find: the ice beam and the wave beam. The ice beam, as mentioned, freezes enemies in their tracks, while the wave beam can be fired through walls and obstacles, and also travels in a zigzag pattern to hit enemies just above and below Samus's eyeline. The catch is that the player has to choose one or the other. Both beams cannot be used at the same time. Samus can only fire in three directions: left, right, and up, and she can't crouch or aim down. So the wave beam definitely has its advantages, but for the most part, unfortunately, the choice really isn't as much of an even split as I think the game wants it to be. Heading to the game's final area without the ice beam is essentially suicide, as it's the only effective weapon in stopping the game's eponymous Metroid enemies, which behave more aggressively and intelligently than any other monster in the game, and can be major threats to the player. It seems like the developers even knew this, since the ice beam can actually be picked up in two separate locations, one of which being pretty close to this final area. There's also unfortunately one or two moments of kind of unfair level design. Like, these tall, thin towers in Norfair are situated above pits of lava and require precision jumps to traverse safely, but are also surrounded by enemies that can knock Samus around. If Samus falls between two towers into the lava, she literally can't jump high enough to get back up, even with the high jump boots. So if this happens, the player is forced to just flail around helplessly while Samus's health bar ticks away until they get a game over. I ended up falling here the first few times I attempted to cross these screens, no matter how ready I was to anticipate each jump. It really might have been better to just put some sort of instant death pit here if they really wanted this area to be as treacherous as it is. Because at least then, if the player screws up, they won't have to sit and wait for a minute or so while their character's health slowly drains. It just seems like kind of shoddy game design to me. The Japanese Famicom version of Metroid was capable of recording 3 concurrent save files, but I guess Nintendo of America didn't see it worth the time or money to make battery-powered NES cartridges like with Zelda. Instead, the US Metroid uses a traditional password save system, and due to the number of variables the game has to keep track of in its code, these passwords can get pretty complicated. I guess it makes sense that they wouldn't see the need for battery backups in this game, though. Unlike Zelda, Metroid can be completed in just a couple hours, and in fact it has multiple endings based on how fast the player finishes. It also even has its own second quest, so to speak, allowing the player to keep all their upgrades the second time around. If the player gets the fastest ending, they can even play as Samus without her bulky space armor. Or they can just use the Narpus sword password, whatever that means, to access the developer's test mode, where the player is literally invincible. There's also the infamous Justin Bailey code, which starts the player off with all the upgrades and most of the missiles. But unlike the Narpus sword, this password was never actually an intended cheat code. Players have done a lot of research into this mysterious password over the years, but are unable to find any real meaning behind it, nor any official word from Nintendo about it. As far as anyone can tell, the fact that the name Justin Bailey just happens to activate an almost complete save file seems to be a total fluke. I like to imagine some random kid in the 80s, little Justin Bailey, seeing the password screen and thinking it was a name input screen, and then word just spread from there and history was made. Overall, and it may be a bit unfair for me to say this after all these years of hindsight, the first Metroid game, I think, doesn't really stand the test of time. For being such an important piece of gaming history, I was surprised to see that it currently only holds a score of 58 on Metacritic, a number that would be considered unacceptable from any other franchise. Metroid is one of those games that's really only worth checking out in the context of the greater franchise it's a part of, rather than being a good game in its own right. This is made especially true thanks to the existence of Metroid Zero Mission, a complete remake of Metroid that improves on it in every conceivable way. If you do decide to check this game out though, I would suggest doing so without using a walkthrough. Like with Zelda, just look up a handful of maps and trust your instincts from there. If you do decide to use a guide though, I'm personally fond of this one on the Metroid Database fan site. This is cute. It doesn't cover every last hidden item, but it points you to all the most important places, and is presented in this hand-drawn style, and written as though it's from Samus's perspective. The Metroid fanbase is just so earnest, it's adorable. And folks, that's going to do it for Volume 2 of this video series. We covered 3 pretty big killer apps from Nintendo this time. If you liked the video, be sure to hit the like button. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe because I'll have more on the way. And also consider donating to the Patreon. The link is in the description. So until next time, gamers and tamers, you all just keep doing what you're doing, whatever that is. Yeah, we'll see ya.